Hello everyone. This is our first story of the year, and I wish you all a very happy and prosperous 2020. For tonight, we're going to continue with the story about utopia, urbanism, and architecture that we began at the end of last year. And this time we're going to focus on the past 100 years and see how urban design and architecture have evolved. We will look at different scales, from the interior design of homes to entire planned communities. If you ever wondered what the Bauhaus, Brutalism, or the Modernist style were, you will find answers, and we will also examine various planned cities of the 20th century, from Brazil to France to the UK and more. We will take a look at different city concepts too, some older like garden cities, and some more recent like arcologies. Because like in past centuries, as we saw in part 1, the old dream of shaping or at least bettering communities through architecture is more alive than ever. It just takes different shapes with the evolution of technologies, transportation, or lifestyles. So this is part 2, and you will find a link to part 1 in the description. But you don't need to listen to part 1 to understand what follows. And there's a lot to talk about, but don't worry, it will be very easy to follow and very easy to understand as long as you relax and let me do the rest. Now adopt a comfortable position, keep an open mind, and in a minute we will begin our exploration journey. If you wish to download this story to have it offline, this is possible from my Patreon page in a video or audio format. There is a link in the first comment. All along the story you can decide to close your eyes anytime, as the visuals are only optional and you can start sleeping whenever you want. There are timestamps in the first comment if you wish to resume the story later. Now take a deep breath. Our story is about to begin. As a starting point, we are going to begin with yet another story, that of probably the most ambitious urban planning project ever, Brasilia. Brasilia nowadays is the third largest city in Brazil. Its metropolitan area has more than 4 million inhabitants. But 60 years ago, there was nothing on the site, which is located inland in the center-west of Brazil. Brasilia is the embodiment of decades of thinking about urban designs and about the idea of modernity as it was understood in the 1950s and 1960s. Taking a look at the history of Brasilia, all the choices and the vision behind its planning, this opened a window on the major trends in architecture, urban planning, and the concept of ideal city in the 20th century, including all the problems, dilemmas, and shortcomings that came with it. The decision to build Brasilia was taken in the 1950s, and the first plans were drawn in this decade. Before that, the capital city of Brazil was Rio de Janeiro, from Brazil's independence to 1960. In the 19th century, newly independent countries in Latin America fought between them to stabilize their frontiers. They attracted a large European immigration and they integrated into global trade with a big inflow of American and European investment. But they were still lightly populated. For example, Brazil had only 14 million inhabitants in 1890, and 10 years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, 17 million. Today it has more than 200 million. On a smaller scale, many Latin American countries experienced the same demographic boom in the 20th century, multiplying their population by 10 or 15 in a few generations. Brazil and the rest of Latin America also grew economically, but in an erratic way. The 20th century was a period of alternance between booms and busts, often dependent on the global economy. They enjoyed a period of boom until the end of the First World War. At the time, just a century ago, a country like Argentina had a flourishing economy, with an income per capita almost similar to that of Western Europe or America. But after that, in the 1920s and even worse in the 1930s, it went downhill from there. European countries cut their imports after the First World War, and when the Depression arrived in the 1930s, Latin American and the economy of Brazil plunged. They were, for a large part, and they still are, quite dependent on the export of commodities. So they tend to suffer from economic crisis when more industrialized countries are in recession, and sometimes they amplify this crisis. But after the Second World War, and until the 1970s, a new period of expansion began. Many Latin American countries modernized themselves, and they made plans to become first world nations with a strong industrial base and a modern infrastructure. Brazil was seen as maybe the most promising of them all in the 1950s and 1960s, with its large size, its fast expansion, its growing population, thriving cities that were turning into metropolis like São Paulo or Rio. But once again the boom ended. In the 1970s there was another downturn that lasted long into the 80s, with huge inflation problems that impoverished the middle class. And with this economic crisis came military dictatorships in various countries: Argentina, Chile, Brazil. The 1980s have been called the lost decade for many Latin American countries, because in fact they stayed in economic and financial trouble for a long time, and the new model countries for economic development became Asian nations like Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. But in the 1950s, Brazil was making grand plans to join the club of large industrial powers. It was also trying to address the problems that its fast population growth was creating. The population concentrated on the eastern coast, in the southeast of the country, in large cities like São Paulo and Rio, that were growing incredibly fast and were faced with poverty, slums, insecurity, congestion, lack of housing. Brazil needed to modernize its cities, and decentralize, limit the concentration of people on a small part of the territory. And Brasilia was a response to these issues, a new, modern capital planned from the start and located in a more central region that would at the same time enable and represent Brazil's entry into modernity. There had been plans for a long time to move the capital away from Rio. But finally, under the impulsion of a new president, Juscelino Kubitschek, the decision was acted in 1956, and the plan for the new city to be built entirely from scratch was selected by a jury. The jury selected among several plans, and the winner was an architect called Lucio Costa, a student of Le Corbusier. We will talk about Le Corbusier later. A lot of different goals and ambitions were put into those plans. First, the city needed to be monumental. It was a political capital where the executive, legislative and judiciary powers would be based, and the capital of an aspiring great power of the 20th and 21st centuries. This implied that it had to be spectacular. Then it would need to provide housing for hundreds of thousands of people and make choices when it came to mixing or separating social classes, because the development of apartment blocks would be planned, not let to private builders. And it also needed to accommodate a modern lifestyle, not only of course water, electricity and sewers. These things sound rather basic nowadays, but they are actually not that common. For about half of humanity, these are luxuries, even nowadays. In the 1950s, these services were standard in new buildings in industrialized countries, but not that common in Brazil or Latin America in general. But it wasn't just about these utilities. The biggest challenge in the 1950s was to take into account the growing importance of cars, automobile in general, and anticipate its generalization. We will return to this later, because this question of transport and individual cars in particular is probably what impacted cities the most in the past 70 or 80 years. Costa answered all of these needs with a plan called the Plano Piloto, the pilot plan, based on two main axes. Seen from the sky, they look like a bird or an airplane. East to west, there was a so-called monumental axis, with political and administrative activities, and north to south, a residential axis that would not only comprise housing, but all other functions necessary to everyday life, like shops, schools, churches, some small recreation spaces. One central inspiration behind this plan is something I mentioned at the end of part 1, the analysis of human activity by function, housing, commerce, production. One big question for 20th century urbanists was whether it was desirable or not to separate them. This question was not that important before the Industrial Revolution, because cities were smaller and there were no fast means of transportation anyway. So, out of necessity, these functions developed close to one another, and it was their proximity that defined the urban phenomenon. With the tremendous growth of cities that moved from a few thousands or tens of thousands to millions, the question of space and distances between functions became much more acute. And in the 20th century, the development of public transport and cars completely changed the stakes. It became possible to imagine that people could live, work, and shop in locations relatively far from one another. And that was not a bad thing, theoretically. Industrial facilities that had popped up were polluting, and they were considered ugly, so the idea of living far from them was attractive. So was the idea of concentrating trade in commercial centers that would be convenient to offer more variety and a more transparent market by putting all the stores together. But a problem we will come back to is that the strict separation of functions, meaning that you need to use a mean of transport for a significant time every time you want to shop or work or go out. This attacks, or at least this modifies, the experience of living in the city. And this separation was not always well received by real people, inhabitants. It can be inconvenient for individual people and at a general level too, because of the traffic it generates, and areas that were designed exclusively for housing without economic activity can easily turn into ghettos. Nobody wants to go live there. Nobody needs to go either, and only those who have no choice end up using these neighborhoods, which can place them into a vicious circle of problems, poverty, insecurity, little access to the outside world and its opportunities. We'll come back to that later, but this is probably the biggest social issue created by the expansion of cities. Of course, social problems go well beyond urban planning. They are also about education, inclusion, the way the economy and the society work. But when it comes to architecture, the concept of designing large and dense residential complexes far away from jobs and shops, commerce, has been completely abandoned nowadays because they rarely ended well. I'll give you a few examples later. Now returning to Brasilia, this residential axis, north to south, was designed with 96 big blocks where buildings would be limited to 6 stories and 12 more blocks with lower 3 stories buildings. Costa's intention with those blocks was that they would be self-sufficient neighborhoods, super blocks with all the facilities and convenience stores needed for everyday life. The limited height of the buildings and an abundance of tall trees between them would also make them more human and pleasant to live in. The design of these big blocks was based on a plan called the Radburn layout, after Radburn, New Jersey, where this type of layout for housing estates was used. So, what is it? The traditional, the most common way of placing houses in a street is with the entrance facing the street, and with or without a front yard. The Radburn layout has the entrances oriented towards a common front yard or a common lane that is accessible from the street and perpendicular to it So in other terms, there are plenty of dead ends perpendicular to the streets, and homes face one another over this common yard, this common lane. This type of layout was inspired by an older design developed in England in the so-called garden cities. And here the aspiration to utopia is back again into urban planning. So let's spend a few minutes on garden cities because they are very important in the history of urban planning, and they influenced many other projects from the 20th century, including Brasilia. The founder of the Garden City movement was a British man called Howard. He was born in a humble family. His father was a baker, but he studied enough to become a clerk, and in his 20s he traveled to the US before returning to England. He had a clerk job for the rest of his life, but apart from that, he became involved in his spare time with utopian circles. He knew about the early utopian socialists we discussed in part 1 of this story, like Robert Owen or Charles Fournier. He was in contact with socialists, anarchists, and his personal hobby became an attempt to figure out how to combine the best aspects of life in the cities and life in the countryside. He gathered his ideas in an influential book, the only one he ever published, called Garden Cities of Tomorrow. The title is from 1902, and the book was first published in 1898. And it quickly proved very influential, and it gave rise to this Garden City movement. It is a method of urban planning, this Garden City project, in which communities are surrounded by green belts. He imagined an ideal city for 32,000 people on a wide area of 6,000 acres. That's very low density, and the city's pattern would be concentric, with radial boulevards and parks extending from the center. When a garden city would be fully populated, another one could be developed nearby, and these cities could be connected by road and rail, forming clusters. Each city would be mostly self-sufficient and offer space, access to nature, and a healthy environment, and at the same time the advantages of a city with jobs, shops, industries, education, connections to other cities. The interest in his ideas allowed the creation of an association funded by investors and philanthropists for the building of the first garden city, the city of Letchworth, near London. Letchworth is an important step in the history of urbanism. It is the first garden city and one of the first new towns in modern times. It did quite well economically, but not exactly as intended by Howard. One of his goals was to offer the working class better living conditions. In that sense, he was a direct follower to the paternalist industrialists from the 19th century that we discussed last time. He wished the working class well and sincerely wished to improve its condition, but that would be through the imposition of a lifestyle and an environment designed for them, not by them. However, Letchworth had investors who expected the project to pay dividends one day, and instead of becoming a social project, It was marketed and sold to middle-class skilled workers who could afford the relatively expensive houses put on sale. With this population, it worked, except that it had very little blue-collar population, because Letchworth ended up somewhat different from what he had expected. Howard invested his own money to buy land in 1919 and create another garden city called Welwyn. Welwyn was even closer to the center of London, only 20 miles. This proximity was at the same time a blessing and a curse for the project. A blessing because it was close enough to jobs and the big city to attract people. But the curse is that it never really became self-sufficient as intended, and instead turned into a mainly residential area without the integration of industries, offices and shops that were part of Howard's vision. In any case, Letchworth and Welwyn still exist today as parts of London's metropolitan area, and they are landmarks in the history of urban planning. They inspired other garden cities around the world, but in the UK not so much. There was no other garden city launched in the 1920s and 1930s, but they still had an influence after World War II, when new towns were founded. We'll come back to that later with examples in the UK and France. One of the main critiques to garden cities was that they spread on a large area. This is not something popular at all nowadays with environment specialists or urbanists, because the lack of density tends to increase consumption and waste of resources. That was not such a concern a century ago, but still garden cities were criticized for destroying nature and urbanizing a large surface. In countries with a high density of population, which includes most of European countries, it is not a type of city design that looks very sustainable. Another big criticism was the layout of homes with the laneways used as common entries and exits to the houses, the same layout later used in Radburn and later even in Brasilia, which was the reason why I started telling you about the Radburn layout and garden cities. Over the following decades, this type of layout has been blamed for how it could easily turn groups of houses into ghettos and separate communities. The lane connected to the street is a half public, half private kind of space. It is accessible to everyone, theoretically, but in reality only the people living in the lane are supposed to use it. So it creates a space that is separated from the axis of transportation, where most people and the police circulate. This, combined with a young, impoverished population and drug dealing or small traffics, can create multiple pockets where small groups take control of the lanes and do whatever they want in them. Over the past few decades, many urban renovation projects in social housing have tried to eliminate that kind of pattern that had become very common in the UK, in the US or Australia. However, apart from this layout that has sometimes proved unfortunate, garden cities were not failures. In particular, they avoided much bigger problems that appeared in new towns of the second half of the 20th century that had only housing and almost nothing else, and turned into dormitory cities. The concept of keeping homes, shops, and jobs close to one another is still considered nowadays a good option by most urban planners. So now let's return to Brasilia and see what happened there. I was telling you that residential areas were designed as big blocks, super blocks, with all the services people may need in their everyday life, except the jobs. Another objective of the plan was to allow the free flow of automobile traffic in the entire city. People were planned to use cars. In that sense, Costa got it right because it is what they did. And to facilitate car traffic, he designed large roads, large lanes in the north-south axis. These large roads distribute access roads to the superblocks. The specialization of sectors went on in the initial plan. Near the city center, where the north, south and east-west axis cross, there was to be a hotel sector, a banking sector, an amusement center with theaters, cinemas and restaurants. One advantage of this plan is that it already anticipated on flows. Everywhere people would need to circulate, there would immediately be streets ready, and the city could be operational from day one, and every part of the plan was well connected. A disadvantage, though, is how rigid the plan is. Brasilia was designed for automobile traffic, and a number of activities identified in the 1950s as key to modern urban life and what it was anticipated to be in the future. But the plan was made for a certain number of inhabitants and a certain lifestyle. As we have seen in previous examples, this is the biggest challenge to planned or ideal cities. Their ability to adapt is limited, and almost systematically, the future and the way people use facilities is different from the initial plan. And this is what happened to Brasilia. The initial plan, the Plano Piloto, was designed for a population of about 500,000 people. But from the beginning, the growth of Brasilia was greater than estimated. In a sense, the city was victim of its success. In 1960, the year of the foundation, the federal district, where the city is located, had 140,000 inhabitants. By 1970, more than 500,000. By 2010, 2.5 million, and even today, Brasilia keeps growing fast, at almost 3% per year. So in a matter of years, satellite cities had already appeared around it, like suburbs, and this population and their movement immediately interfered with the carefully planned initial project. By the end of the 20th century, Brasilia was the largest city in the world that didn't exist at the beginning of the same century. The city is now regarded by some as a dystopia, the opposite to the ideal city it was intended to be. But Brasilia probably deserves a more balanced judgment, because many of its citizens grew attached to it, and it is attractive. It is the fastest growing large city in the country, so it must be doing something right. The main negative argument is that it actually doesn't feel like a city because of zoning and too much emphasis on automobile. Modern urbanists tend to define the urban experience as the mix of functions. Housing is near shops and services. You can walk or travel short distances and have access to most of the things you need: banks, shops, schools, entertainment. Brasilia was never intended to work this way. You can barely walk, and the zoning forces a particular way of moving inside the city that is, in a sense, the opposite of freedom. It's rigid, and not much can be done to change that. In other words, Brasilia feels more like a giant, oversized campus than an actual city, or what we generally call a city. But to be fair, this criticism applies only to the initial plan, to the Plano Piloto, which is now just the historic center of the city, but no longer where the majority of the population lives. So if we take into account the entire urban area, Brasilia is a more regular kind of city, with just a particular center. It also depends on where people come from and what they are accustomed to. For someone coming from the center of an European city or some American cities like New York City or San Francisco, it can be very disturbing. Not so much for someone from a large city that has multiple centers, like Los Angeles, for example. Another criticism is that Brasilia wasn't that modern, save for the integration of automobile in its plan. The monumental axis may be built in a modernist architecture. We're going to talk about this particular style. But the very concept of having perspectives and large avenues with monuments, like Paris or Washington, is just a transposition of the 19th century, which itself took inspiration from antique cities, Roman or Egyptian cities. In the 20th century, this kind of architecture was actually a favorite of totalitarian regimes, the large monumental avenues with modernist buildings, like in the USSR, Germany or Italy. Some critique that quickly appeared against Brasilia, or at least its center, is that it was not human, too cold, too monumental to coexist with the other goals of the city of taking advantage of this creation to establish a more harmonious, easy to live society. Brasilia had potentially conflicting objectives that maybe could not all be reached at the same time. One that was clearly not reached was the initial ambition of mixing social classes in the residential blocks. As the city grew, poorer people moved outside to satellite cities that are part of the urban area and have now been absorbed by it. Only the rich stayed in the Plano Piloto, and Brasilia just replicated in a short time the kind of segregation based on wealth that is observed in pretty much all big cities around the world, but to an extreme in Latin America and Brazil. Consciously or not, social classes put in place mechanisms to separate themselves physically from lower classes. And it's not just the super rich, the middle class does it too. One thing that Brasilia teaches us, but this mechanism generally proves irresistible everywhere, is that urbanism is probably not able on its own to significantly change society. It is humbling for urban planners. They can certainly sort out a lot of problems and improve the quality of life. But the old dream of reshaping society through urban geography and architecture keeps failing. It doesn't work, or for it to work, it would probably require to force behaviors on people in a way that is probably not compatible with individual freedom and a democratic society. Too much coercion, forcing people, defeats by definition the concept of a real utopia, which has to be accepted by its participants. But on the other hand, the city attracts people. It is rather prosperous. Of course, the presence of the government and embassies creates well-paid jobs, but not only. It has become an economic center in its own right. And nowadays it is the Brazilian city with the highest income per capita, well above larger metropolis like São Paulo or Rio. Many visitors praise the haunting beauty of the architecture, its cohesion, and the abundance of space. Maybe even more than in the 1960s when the city was founded, space is the real luxury nowadays when you live in a city, and the center of Brasilia offers a lot of it. And after all, Brasilia is still a very young city. History is already happening to it, and when you think about it, all cities that we know worldwide for having a particular soul or generate a strong attachment from their citizens have centuries of history. They have developed into what they are because they received layer after layer of generations, projects. People have changed lifestyle while occupying the same location. This is what gives these cities a depth and creates a particular way of life. This process of evolution never ends. Sometimes it's for the best and sometimes not, but Brasilia is just beginning to exist. It will certainly work differently in a generation or two, but because of its particular history and center, whatever happens, it will always be a testimony of a certain vision of modernity 60 years ago. Now the most striking architecture in Brasilia is that of the various monuments and their modernist architecture. There is the cathedral that looks like a spaceship or a giant flower. It is made of 16 columns that meet in the upper section and then diverge. There is the presidential palace. It is all concrete and glass. The ground floor serves for receptions and the second floor is the residential part. And another famous landmark is the National Congress. All these buildings were designed by the same architect, Oscar Niemeyer, and they are one aspect of a major school, a trend in architecture in the 20th century called Modernism or Modernist Architecture. So let's spend time on this because even though modernism has evolved now, it looks a bit retro nowadays, and it has also received a lot of criticism. It still has an influence on current styles, even when they reject it. And this is a type of architecture you are probably familiar with, because it was used a lot worldwide for public buildings in particular, schools, hospitals, administrations, and airports too. Not only in the West, communist countries also adopted it in the 60s and 70s. Modernism in architecture is not a rigid style that would be codified and precisely dated. It is the product of two things: a set of ideas and new technologies of construction. Which ideas? First, there was all this thinking process about urbanism in the 19th century that we discussed in the first part of this video. I told you that the term urbanism was coined at the end of the 19th century, and in particular this urbanistic thought included the distinction of functions: housing, economic functions like production, exchange functions like commerce, and the idea emerged that in a new type of architecture, the function of a particular building or a particular area would have to determine, to dictate the form, because that would be more productive, more meaningful, more convenient too. Probably also because innovation for itself was a positive concept in the West, it still is, and that was a possible path to innovate. Another important idea that appeared in parallel was a taste for simplicity, for minimalism. And that was a reaction to the very ornate kind of architecture that dominated in the second part of the 19th century. The style of choice in the last decades of the 19th century, especially for public buildings and monuments, was called the Beaux-Arts style. The one city where it triumphed the most was probably Paris, but every major city in the world built libraries, museums, or courthouses in this style. Beaux-Arts is very ornate. It is a composite style that mixes Baroque and neoclassical architecture with a lot of decoration in stone or stucco. There are statues, frescoes, details everywhere. Sometimes it also drew inspiration from earlier styles, Neo-Byzantine, Neo-Gothic. Examples of this include the Paris Opera House, or the Grand Palais, or the Palace of Justice in Brussels that looks like a giant Babylonian palace with Baroque decoration. That's another good example. Many of these large buildings also took advantage of technical innovations. Behind all the statues and ornaments of all kinds, there are iron structures, and for the latest ones, even reinforced concrete. But by the beginning of the 20th century, this Beaux-Arts craze was already fading, and people got a bit tired of these buildings that looked like giant wedding cakes. They never went totally out of favor, though, and even today they are almost never destroyed and always preserved when cities remodel themselves. Some people find them kitsch, but in general they keep being seen as gorgeous by the majority. They blend well with all the styles in cities like Paris, Rome or Vienna, and people grew attached to them. Maybe because they are spectacular, but they also remain entertaining, and they convey a sense of opulence. But still, the early 20th century was characterized by a certain rejection of extremely ornate architecture, and in the 1920s and 30s, this gave birth to a precursor of modernist architecture called Art Deco or modern style, not to be confused with modernist. Modern style architecture is typical of the 1930s. It has cleaner lines and not that many ornaments. There are few curves and more geometric details. An example of that is the Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, but once again it was international. Fascist and communist regimes adopted variants of this style in the 1930s too. Under some aspects, it is a revival of neoclassic architecture, with its emphasis on symmetry and a very large scale. The taste for minimalism only grew further after the Second World War, and it very much influenced 1950s and 60s architecture. So these are the ideas that contributed to modernism: simplicity, little to no ornaments, an utilitarian approach to buildings, and the concept that their function has to decide their shapes, both externally and internally. And these ideas met new building materials: glass that had become way cheaper, steel, and reinforced concrete that allowed new heights and new shapes. Reinforced concrete is just regular concrete with a metal grid or metal bars inside. It makes it much more resilient to collapse and harder to destroy. With modernist architecture started a construction method for large buildings that is still used today. The buildings may be dressed with glass or concrete or stone, but the structure is metallic. It is made of steel. There is a wide range of shapes and many different important architects from the 20th century that used and influenced this modernist architecture movement, and it triumphed in the post-war period, roughly until the 60s and early 70s. This movement allowed the creation of new shapes. It was generally very luminous, thanks to large openings, always minimalist, and in the 1950s it was the embodiment of modernity in architecture. And this modernist movement didn't stay limited to architecture. It also paid attention to interior design, from rooms and their functions inside a house to the furniture and appliances even. A very important influence here is the Bauhaus, founded in 1919. What is it? The Bauhaus means literally building house, and it was a German art school created by a German architect called Walter Gropius. The Bauhaus ambition very much reflected the preoccupation for the creation of a better lifestyle, a better society that is at the heart of this two-part story I am telling you. Gropius wanted to bring together art, design, and architecture to create a new art form, the art of the living space. And this extended to buildings, to furniture, to colors, graphic design, industrial design. Objects had to blend beauty, simplicity, and mass production so that they would not only innovate and improve life, but even shape a more harmonious, rational, and fair society. Concretely, the Bauhaus produced a vast array of designs, plans for interior architecture, entire buildings sometimes, objects from chairs to tables to closets. It was also active in graphic design and created new fonts, an entire aesthetic made of pure, very simple lines and affordable materials. It was closed in 1933 when the Nazis took power in Germany. For an institution that only lasted for 14 years, it was very influential. The Bauhaus movement influenced many architects and was a key component in the emergence of the Modernist architecture that triumphed in Brasilia. And not only in the monuments, in the apartment blocks too. In the 1950s, in the West, the need for quickly available and affordable housing was stronger than ever. There had been destruction all over Europe during the Second World War. The population was soaring. The growth of cities was accelerating, so new homes had to be massively produced. It has been a bit forgotten today, but the reality of housing in the 1950s or 60s in Western Europe was way worse than today. To a degree, all countries are constantly faced with housing issues. There are never enough homes, and they are not affordable for a significant part of the population. This is still a reality today. But the proportions this problem took were even bigger 60 or 70 years ago, due to the combination of war destruction and growing population in countries like Germany, France, Italy, Britain. There were townships well into the 1960s. The housing crisis was massive. So they all engaged in aggressive construction programs. New towns were founded about at the same time when Brasilia was being designed. And the aspect of urban areas changed dramatically in 2 or 3 decades from the 50s to the 70s. The ideas and plans from architects that had been elaborated in the 1930s and 40s served as the basis for this urban revolution. And one such figure, maybe the most prominent architect of modernism, was a man called Le Corbusier. He was Franco-Swiss, already experienced in the 1950s. He had already designed buildings internationally during his career. In 1930, he produced a project that was never realized, called the Ville Radieuse, the Radiant City. It was never built, but the ideas were very influential and controversial too, and they directly impacted the project of Brasilia. During almost his entire life, Le Corbusier thought and chased the concept of ideal city. The Radiant City would have been a long line of buildings with zoning, the separation of functions, and high-rise housing blocks surrounded by vegetation and all gathered around a central axis for transport and communication, like an oversized highway. Brasilia had a different plan and limited the height of the buildings, but the concept is not that different. One criticism that quickly emerged against Le Corbusier and modernist architecture, one that still exists today, was the lack of human scale and the coldness of their work. It makes sense conceptually, it can be aesthetical, it is always very hygienic. But many people don't like to live in these places, either because they are too radical and disorienting, or they completely lack a sense of home. In other words, they may be designed to improve life, but they tend to look and feel totalitarian because they obliterate the individual. They look like a giant ant farm. It didn't help that many communist countries, starting with the USSR, adopted these principles for their own urbanization, and they ended producing communities that looked all the same and were seen as dehumanizing. And in fact, more often than not, Le Corbusier's buildings are praised for their innovation and aesthetics, but when they are for housing, they tend to be disliked or reappropriated differently by their inhabitants. Because he did build apartment blocks, and his most famous design is called the Unité d'Habitation, habitation unit. It is a modernist residential housing design, and several housing developments in Europe were built based on it. There are 5 in France and 1 in Germany. The most famous one is located in the south of France, in the city of Marseille. It was built between 1947 and 1952. It comprises more than 300 apartments over 12 stories. All apartments are in duplex, and the concept of the habitation unit is to be a miniaturized city. There is a gallery with shops, one floor with reception bedrooms. The apartments are not big enough to have a spare room for guests. So Le Corbusier figured out that the residents could have guest rooms like a hotel belonging to them that they could use for their guests when necessary, and they would manage the rooms collectively. There was also a communal terrace on the roof. It was planned to have rooms for events, a library, all of this managed by the community of residents. These types of services are similar to what you find in modern condominiums, but this was 70 years ago, when this concept was a first, and it was a social housing project designed for working class residents, not apartment buyers. Apartments were luminous, entirely furnished and almost identical. Not many of these units have been built, and the truth is that the kind of community life that they were supposed to favor never really worked, as intended at least. But the design was highly influential. If you live in an apartment block built after the 1960s, the interior design of your apartment and the services available for the entire community of residents were probably influenced by this design. As I say, the only unit that has been really adopted by its residents is the one in Marseille, in the south of France. But it is no longer a social housing project. The entire building has been gentrified, in a sense, and it now belongs to owners from the middle and upper middle class, people looking for a different alternative lifestyle, who are also aware of the historic significance of the building they live in. The community guest rooms have been turned into a privately run hotel. Other units in France, and there is also one in Germany, in Berlin, haven't been that successful, and they were generally avoided by residents. They were filled with people who had no other option, and they acquired a bad reputation locally. But still, these units are a testimony of 20th century attempts at the real utopia. Another significant aspect of the habitation unit is that it was one of the first examples of an evolution of modernist architecture called brutalism. Brutalist architecture is a ramification of modernism rather than a different style. The name brutalism sounds very hostile, like brutal, but it's not that bad. It comes from French, the French word brutalisme, and brut in France means raw, bare, when applied to a material. In the 50s began the habit of leaving bare building materials, often concrete, visible on the buildings. This choice was called brutalism because the materials remained brut, and the word passed to English to give brutalism, but it is not based on brutal, even though the words have the same root. Brutalist buildings push even further the minimalism of modernist architecture. They have no ornaments at all, and designs are almost always geometric. It was sometimes used in social housing and also a lot in institutional buildings like city halls, courts or libraries. Even more than modernist architecture, brutalism is very polarizing. The critics find it cold and hostile. And a fact also is that exposed concrete doesn't always age well, so that brutalist buildings can be associated with urban decay. But some brutalist works have acquired landmark status, and they are valuable testimonies of the recent past. For example, there is the Barbican complex, the Barbican Estate in London. It's a housing estate in the very center of London, built from the 1960s, and it's an example of brutalist housing. It contains various towers and institutions too, and also reflects another trend in 1960s urbanism and designs. The elimination of streets, or rather the separation of walking surfaces that are placed upon an elevated slab, and cars which are underground on a lower level. Another example of this type of urbanism can be found in Paris, the business district of La Défense, with high rises and a large open space at their base, whereas all traffic, cars, subway, trains and the parking lots, all of this takes place underground. La Défense was also designed in the 1960s. I told you a lot about Brasilia today because it is emblematic and opens many doors on 20th century utopias and architecture. But the creation of new towns and cities from scratch was a wider phenomenon, especially in Europe. Communist countries were big city creators in Eastern Europe. Their housing needs were gigantic, and actually they were never fixed. Decent housing was still lacking at the end of the 80s when they collapsed politically. But in the West too, the move started in the UK with the creation of new towns and the transformation of rural areas into urbanized areas on a large scale. This started shortly after the war in 1946, when the shortage of housing called for immediate urbanization. This was the time when the region of London and its urbanized area grew very quickly in various directions. The urbanization of regions like Essex started in those years. New projects kept being launched until the 1970s in Britain. In France, too, there were various new cities that were created, especially in the region of Paris, to sustain the rise in population and satisfy the need for housing. All these new projects received the influence of past movements we discussed, the thinking process about functions and how to articulate them, the question of social diversity, how to avoid complete segregation between social groups when it tends to happen spontaneously. If social segregation is accepted, how to make it work, how to make individual liberties coexist with collective needs too. These are some of the basic questions that urbanism keeps dealing with, and the quest for, if not an ideal, at least a better city, is still going on, from the various new cities that are currently being built in China to Dubai, or in every urban remodeling that takes place around the world. The past few decades have seen plenty of ideas and projects appear based on new technologies and challenges like the environmental footprint. Modernist architecture, like in Brasilia, has also given way to new styles. All of these keep trying to give shape to the old dream of ideal city. An example from the late 60s, more of a concept really, because there are no plans for it, is called the arcology, a word that combines architecture and ecology. The idea has been popularized by science fiction mainly. No one has ever been built, and the concept of arcology would be an architectural design for a densely populated habitat, a human habitat, that would be self-sufficient and have a minimal ecological impact. For example, it could be a single giant tower where housing, retail, industries, farms would all coexist and people would never need to leave it. Or maybe several towers connected by bridges or tunnels. Modernist architecture is slowly becoming a part of history. It may have been the one style of architecture most inspired by utopia and the belief that urbanism could model society. It has left a lot of landmarks, buildings around the world, apart from the ones I already mentioned. Another good example is the Opera House of Sydney, probably the most famous Australian building around the world. But the ambition has not disappeared. To a degree, it is present in every urban project. It guides choices. The movement that succeeded modernism is called postmodern architecture, and it started in the 1960s, 1970s, mainly as a reaction against the shortfalls of modernism, its austerity, the lack of variety, the absence of connection between most modernist buildings and the places where they are built. In a sense, modernist architecture lacks a soul. It's a very common critique of it. It is very conceptual. Sometimes it can draw a bit of inspiration from local shapes, but overall, visually, they have no connection to any particular culture or tradition, especially in the kind of highly minimalistic international style of Le Corbusier or Niemeyer, the one that is represented in Brasilia. Postmodernism is not an unified style at all, and it is way less conceptual than modernism, but probably more popular. It is an approach that tries to reintroduce ornaments and distinctive features in buildings that connect them to their environment to a culture, to a tradition. That is achieved by working on the facades mainly. Actually, from the inside, postmodern buildings are not particularly new or different, but facades incorporate historical elements, modulations, ornaments that make them more interesting and less uniform. One critique to this movement is that it could be reactionary. It's at the same time a call to celebrate older styles, a bit like the Beaux-Arts style did 150 years ago, and also a call to resist the temptation of utopia and instead make buildings that people relate to, that they can be immediately familiar with. Postmodern was the style of choice for malls in America or in Europe in the 80s or the 90s. It also influenced housing. Postmodern buildings often look like a brutalist building that would have been decorated with columns, fake windows, a bit of detailing to break the monotony. One criticism addressed to postmodern is that it produces a fake imitation or a pastiche of the past. It is full of references, but sometimes citing things, referencing things, is not equivalent to producing culture. It can even be the opposite of it. It is fair to say that postmodern buildings can be so different from one another, and the movement is so diverse that it doesn't make much sense to criticize it in its entirety. Maybe an observation that has some pertinence is that the rejection of utopia and of the ambition to invent new forms fit quite well with the 80s and 90s. This is the time when the biggest attempt ever at creating a real utopia, communism, finally collapsed. And nowadays, ideologies that pretend to transform society are watched with a lot of suspicion. We are also in a time of strong individualism, and this conflicts with the concept of utopia, which by definition has to be collective. So that utopia tends to be transferred to a smaller scale, the scale of a community, rather than the society at large. But still there are large buildings and housing projects that keep trying. I will end this story with a couple of examples taken from the region of Paris. The French government and administrations kept funding social housing projects in the 80s and 90s, and they allowed architects with atypical ideas and a conceptual approach to design them. In the west of the Paris region, there are apartment blocks called the Les Arcades, shaped like giant castles from the Loire Valley. In the east, in a planned city called Noisy-le-Grand, there is a place called Picasso's Arenas, with buildings that look like vertical wheels. And maybe the weirdest and most haunting of these projects is a housing complex in the same city, Noisy-le-Grand, called Les Espaces d'Abraxas, built in the 1980s. Les Espaces means the spaces, and Abraxas is a Greek term that is loosely defined. It could be the name of a god or a demon. So Abraxas spaces for a housing project may sound a bit pretentious, but that's the name. Maybe you've seen it already without knowing what it was, because this project was used as a set for various movies, including Brazil by Terry Gilliam in the 80s, and more recently the Hunger Games. Les Espaces d'Abraxas is a social housing complex with 600 apartments in 3 buildings. One is an 18 stories massive palace covered in neoclassical or neo-Greek ornaments. There is also a semicircular one evoking an antique theatre, and a third, smaller one in between the two, looking like an arch. This is a typical postmodern work. It draws inspiration from familiar architectural features that it uses in a building with a new shape and function. The architect, Ricardo Bofill, actually said he was doing the opposite to Le Corbusier when he presented this project. Instead of a cold, minimalist architecture, he was designing a baroque, intentionally complex and hopefully relatable environment that people would be able to take possession of, because it resembled the complexity of a city that would have grown organically. And indeed, the palace is a maze of internal and external corridors distributing the apartments. The unique aspect of the project and the feeling of living inside a monument were intended to make its residents grow attached to it, and some of them did. But overall, the complex failed to become attractive, and it turned into a place of exile for many of its residents. It's not all because of the architecture. It was supposed to receive a limited percentage of fragile population to ensure a degree of variety in backgrounds and financial means between the residents. But in the end, the complex received many families with little to no income, which multiplied problems. An unfortunate consequence of the internal complexity of the building was that groups of young residents took control of the common parts, and because it was a maze, the police could not intervene inside. So it became a safe haven for drug dealers and various businesses, not of the legal kind. This project suffered from the same problems many others encountered in large social housing projects. When they are completed, apartments are attributed in priority to families with young children, which makes sense. The first years are fine, but 10 years later, half the residents are teenagers. They are massively overrepresented, and when such a project lacks connections to the outside world, and parents lose control of their children, the situation can turn explosive. However, in recent years, the situation improved at Les Espaces d'Abraxas. Some parts that had been deteriorated were renovated, and the place tends to acquire an aura for its very particular architecture and atmosphere. But once more, architecture has displayed its limited capacity to solve social issues. We could go on like this for a long time, and we actually barely scratched the surface of 20th and 21st centuries architecture. Maybe I'll come back to this in another story. But for now, we have reached the end of our adventure for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library. In any case, I will speak to you soon. Au revoir.